write this book. At that time itself, I had decided I'll ask him when the book is done that can we have a conversation at Takshashila. So thanks to Dr. Rao for agreeing, and thanks for this book and for this talk. So let's begin. And I wanted to, since I began with a personal introduction, I wanted to start this conversation also on a personal note. So how did you get interested in budgets, public finance, and governments?
Thank you, Pranay. I should thank Takshashila for organizing this. Usually, when I write a book, I don't have a release function or any discussion. Quite a few books from Oxford itself. But this time, when I suggested that I should have conversation on the book, I agreed because after I left Delhi, Takshashila had been my host. So obviously, I had a lot of discussion, very pleasant discussion on various aspects of public finance and quite a few other issues. So thanks again. Now, how did I get interested in public finance? It's an accident. It's an accident because I was doing my master's degree in Ahmedabad, and one of the, in Ahmedabad those days there were very few teachers who used to teach in English. It was all in Gujarat. But at that time, Professor Lakawala from Bombay University came there as a director of Sardar Chaudhary Institute, and I was quite enthusiastic in the class. He came as a visiting professor and was quite enthusiastic. So he said, after your exam, you come and see me. So I went and saw him at the Sardar Chaudhary Institute, and he said, we want to offer you a job, and there is a project on commodity taxation in India. I wanted to work with you. So that was my first research work. This was offered even before I formally got my MA degree. So I got interested. I worked with him. Of course, it's basically not a very analytical work. So there is a small book which came out. There was a book by my immediate boss was one, K.V. Nambiar, so Lakadawala and Nambiar. And I was, there was quite a big introduction to me saying thanking me in that book. And subsequently, there was a deputy director of the institute who came from University of Leeds. And possibly he was the most trained person in public finance. And he would start public finance by talking about Anthony Downs, the theory of democracy. And he was a student of Jack Weissman and Alan Peacock, two big stalwarts in public finance. And I started working with him. Learned a lot of modern public finance from him, daily interaction. And then when Lakadawala left and somebody else became the director, he resigned and went to Orissa. So I went with him to Orissa. And I was with him for 4 years, learning about a lot of things. And then we had a big project of determinants of fiscal capacities and needs and their implications for federal transfers. Orissa is not really, particularly the Western Orissa, is not really a place where you can do a lot of research. So I had to go all over the place, collect the material, and learned a lot of fun there, but got interested in that. And afterwards, what happened is that I wrote quite a few articles, including some of them in public finance of public government. Raja Chellaya at that time was starting the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. And he saw these articles, and then he was basically looking for people who were trained, had some training. And he saw my acknowledgement to my guru, Shivchandra Gupta. And when he saw the acknowledgement, he knew Gupta, he called him on the phone. Those days, calling on the phone is an audio. He called him on the phone and then asked him, who is this fellow? So Gupta gave my address. And he sent a telegram to me, asking me to appear for me, refer my, your application, which I had not done.
Salary high.
Asking me to appear for an interview. I appeared for an interview, and he had already decided, and then That was quite a bit. I don't want to get it. But actually, Shetty put me on the board, on his board, and he mentored me. It was quite exciting because, but a lot of the research on, the policy related research, we were all involved. And particularly when we went to 91, after the reform program was taken up, tax reform committee was one of the first to be about it, and we were all helping it. So in that, you started participating in the, policy discussions, apart from the theoretical understanding that you gained from Shivshankar Gupta. So that was the way that.
Great. So now let's get it talking about the book, and the book deals with various aspects of Indian public finance and the history of it, taxation, fiscal federalism, etc. So we have questions on all of that, and we'll discuss them. But before we want to begin in Takshashila tradition in the reverse Bollywood format, right? So we want to get the main star of the book right up front. So what are the main messages of the book?
There is a bit of a sequencing in the book. Why should there be a public finance? If you ask that question, then the question is, why should there be a government?
Yes.
If the markets can provide everything, there is no need for government. So markets cannot provide them. Markets fail to provide certain goods and services, and they have to, therefore, these things cannot be done through, if there is a small, group, like a religious group or a church or a small community, you can have, a club, you can have a club goods or, such as the goods of common interest. But when the common interest is for a larger number of people, voluntary action will not do. That's what Mazer Woodson says. If the voluntary action cannot do, then obviously there should be some coercion. And so obviously there are some goods which are not available in the market, which cannot be accessed in the market. Therefore, somebody has to coerce it, and the government comes into the picture. And we call them public goods. The basic thing that, so I start with the question of, what is the role of the state? And then I go on to the question of, sort of, even if we have the role of the state, then, sort of, there are several areas of market failure. Not all areas of market failure require public spending. There are many areas of market failure which basically require regulation. You cannot substitute, public spending with the regulation. These things should be kept separate. And obviously, the job of the government is not to replace the market. The job of the government is basically to support the market, regulate the market. And basically, so I start with the role of the state. And you should also know that the role of the state, when you talk about it, it implicitly implies that there is an opportunity cost. Because obviously, if you want to run the state, if you want to run public expenditure, then somebody's income has to be taken into it. There is an opportunity cost. That money that you take from somebody could have been used more productively, and then you could have got much higher, benefit. So the original basic idea, when most of the public finance was developed in the Musgravian tradition, is to assume that the government is benevolent, is the social guardian, it can't do anything wrong, and therefore, you should not question that. But that's not what public choice theorists would say. So I start with this basic principle that the role of the state, when you say the state takes a role, it has a certain opportunity cost. And then the state should not replace the market, it should support the market. It should regulate the market. Public provision does not mean public production. The production has to come from somewhere else. Then, again, when all is said and done, there is a beautiful discussion which happened between Richard Musgrave, whom we call father of public finance, and James Buchanan, whom we call father of public choice. This discussion happened in the mid-90s in University of New York, and where basically Musgrave was defending the role of the government, more and more larger and larger government, and Buchanan said that government doesn't maximize the welfare of the people, it's the individual agents within the government who maximize their own welfare. And there is a huge opportunity cost in this particular thing. But then there are certain goods which are not available to in the market, and they have to provide it out. But then government restricts the freedom of the people, and therefore you should also restrict the role of the government. There is a week-long symposium where at such a point of time, Richard Musgrave says, no, there are merit foods. They are so meritorious that it seems the government should come in. Then he said that there are basic public goods which are non-rival in consumption and non-excludable. And therefore, preferences cannot be revealed. There are problems of free riding, and obviously you need the government to come in and coerce to prevent the free riding. Now, basic public goods, and then a redistribution. Redistribution will not be done by the market. Obviously, a redistribution has to be done. How do you do the redistribution? Not by subsidizing. By subsidizing, what you do is you distort the prices. For example, if somebody wants more education to be given, allow the market to do. But then, poor person cannot have the education, give him cash transfers. He decides what to do with the cash transfers. Whether he wants to drink milk, or whether he wants his children to drink milk, or whether he wants himself to drink alcohol. The choice is going to be, how do you assume that the government has a better judgment over you than yourself? I mean, that's a particular viewpoint. So when Musgrave said that these are merit goods, they are so meritorious that we should really provide them in a subsidized manner. Buchanan said that I don't understand these merit goods. You can extend your lawsuit to anything what the government does. And therefore, I mean, it's very clear, keep the government slim, let them provide basic public goods and redistribution, in a non-distortionary manner. That's a public choice perspective. And then they also said, Buchanan and Brennan, went on to say that the government has the monopoly power to tax. Since it has the monopoly power to tax, there is a tendency to tax anyway and then expand the role of the government. I mean, these are all economic issues. But what I'm trying to say is that from our perspective, it's important that the government should not get into the production activity. I mean, there is no reason why the government should start selling alcohol. There is no reason for it to run steel mills. There is no reason for it to run hotels. There is no reason for it to have airlines. And whether it is steel or coal or any of these things. And the other thing is that this concept of, there was this concept of natural monopolies, and therefore there will be a huge volume of investment. But with the changes in technology, things change. So you need to go back and see whether there is a role. Telecom is a very clear example. Electricity is an example. So, I mean, even railways, you can have the railway lines which are given by the government, it can rent it out. And then the railways can be run, sort of privately. But the reason why I'm saying is that government doesn't have a comparative advantage in production and sales, marketing. It doesn't have incentive. But then government may have to regulate them to prevent monopolies from coming up, predatory competition taking place, and there is a possibility. So it can support the government. That's one part of it. The second thing, when it comes to taxation, for example, equity, you need to make differentiation. Then the question that one basic comes up, in fact, this is not something even some of the Nobel Prize winning economists please speak, but once you get a Nobel Prize, you think you can speak on anything. Corporate tax should not be reduced. The simple fact is that capital is mobile, And so labor, which is embodied with capital, is mobile. If there is a mobility, very high mobility of the capital, if it is an open economy, then tax on capital will turn out to be a tax on labor. Why? You tax corporations more, they will simply shift to some other locations. The labor who would have been otherwise employed will lose their job, will not get their job. This particular thing was told way back in 1956 by Arnold Harberger in a paper called Incidence of Corporation Tax. But then for all of us, oh, corporation. So they said, in fact, more modern literature says that tax capital separately and labor. Alan Auerbach, for example, says that. Now the question is, and when I questioned this with Alan, he said, look, that is true, but at the same time, natural resources, for example, which are inelastic, sort of supply inelastic. Obviously, you need to really tap them. So the other important thing that that I talk about is when you talk about these things, what is the objective of the tax policy? Is it the reduction of the incomes of the rich, or what is the policy in this thing, or increasing the incomes of the poor? In other words, you may have you can reduce inequality by reducing everybody's income. You reduce the income of rich person more than that of a poor person, but then poor person loses. But then if you're poor, and you can do it through the tax policy. But then if you really want to reduce poverty, the instrument that you have to use is that of expenditure. Again, not subsidization, but then you can have transfers, conditional cash transfers, minimum support, minimum income scheme, anything that you can have. So the point that I'm trying to make is that when somebody says that, oh, the reduction, the other thing that comes up is direct and indirect taxes. Way back in 1945, there was an author called Haskell Philip Wall who said, this excess burden of indirect taxation is not the thing. And then I.M. Little later wrote a beautiful piece in a book called The Critique of Economic Welfare, where he says that, if the indirect taxes bring a wedge, tax wedge between before the tax goods and untaxed goods. And that's why it distorts the prices. But he says that there's the same thing happens with income tax. So it brings a wedge between income and leisure. So obviously, conceptually, the leisure is also sort of service. So, but then we continue to say. So if you say that reduction in if you say that it is not, and then in the name of inequality reduction, we have multiple tax rates. And then we think, and then there again we see, oh, automobiles are very, sort of, they are luxuries. So tax at 28%. And on top of it says it pays 50%. But something else is not a luxury. But for people working in the automobile industry service sector, people who service this thing are all, in fact, there are people who are poor people. Have we worked out the second round and third round tickets, or have you what we call the general equilibrium? You take the case of construction in the present GST. Any construction material, cement, steel, marble, anything that you take, they tax it, paint, 28%. What are we trying to do? Are we trying to be anti-labor? Now, so what we look at is who finally consumes and then goes up. That's not the only way. We need to achieve the truth. So this direct and indirect taxes, which is very casually told, is not really the way to work. So if you say that this is much of the work on poverty reduction has to come from the expenditure side of the budget, whichever way you want to take it. And I'm not for a moment saying that you need to have a regressive tax system. You can moderate that. I think, which would basically mean the best practice approach to tax reform is broaden the base, reduce the rate differences, and have a simple and transparent tax system. Now you look at what we have done with the GST. Now the other thing that you take the taxes. Tax policy is considered to be a commodity. Now it has to raise revenue. It has to fulfill the objective of equity. it has to look at the small scale industries, it has to promote exports, it has to promote savings, it has to promote the regional equity. What have you? How many things can it do? One instrument, how many objectives you want to promote with that? So instead, you say that, look, I mean, I don't give you any your tax concessions. I will have a small rate, low rate of tax. And so that's basically, and then I don't give all these exemptions. And that's basically the way to go. Of course, every country, sort of industry also wants a lot of concessions to be given. Now, every country, every economist what the name has declared the concessions to, but every country has it. That's that. So this is the second sort of thing. The third important thing that I want to say is on the public debt. Public debt discussion on that has done around quite a bit. In the classical opinion, which James Buchanan, actually, with the neoclassical called it a vulgar opinion, is that the public debt is bad and it is going to hurt the future generation. Then came the neoclassicals, the Keynesians, and the most vociferous presentation of that was by Appa. Lerner said there is nothing like an excess burden on the future generation. It's very simple. And he said, when you float a public debt, people purchase that. There's a voluntary investment that is happening. I mean, they voluntarily invest that money. And when it matures, obviously that has to be paid. So if the taxpayers are, going, it's just an exchange between the taxpayers and the bondholders, and there is no excess burden. There is no burden on the future generation. And it is here that Buchanan comes up again and it says that there is something called an opportunity cost. When you purchase that particular bond, that particular money would have had other opportunity costs. And if by taking that bond, purchasing that bond, if you have not invested properly and then got the rate of return that is necessary to service the bond, the burden of servicing that comes on the future generation. So there were three propositions. One, public debt, whether the future generation holds or not. Second, whether there is a difference between internal and external debt. Classical said that there is obviously there is no difference because whereas neoclassical said that their external debt is different because the servicing has to be done by us to somebody else, and there is no difference between private and public debt. So these three propositions, there's a fascinating discussion that take place. A beautiful book by James Buchanan called Public Principles of Public Debt, where he actually presents their case. He says classical opinion is considered to be vulgar opinion, and then he goes to neoclassical, he calls them new orthodoxy, and then he says this is my opinion. So that's another set of issues that So we need to finally talk about public debt and future generation.
So can we? I can ask a question on this public.
Yeah, go ahead.
So we know from a public debt point of view, India's debt has been rising and significantly higher compared to other emerging market economies as well, right? And now we've also seen contemporary examples of Sri Lanka, Pakistan, etc., because of high debt, what it leads to. So does this expansionary fiscal policy, etc., is it a big cause of worry for India? Because sometimes people say it's a big country, we can still manage, etc. So from a public finance point of view, how do you do?
Well, there is a clear distinction between the debt by the Pakistan, Sri Lanka type and our type. Although there is Buchanan this thing is that the internal and external debt are different, that they are not different. See, when you don't have open convertibility, your convertibility is not, good. You don't have good convertibility. Obviously, servicing the foreign debt is a much more difficult job than that because you need foreign exchange. You don't have that foreign exchange. So you need to earn the foreign exchange. Or somebody else has to loan, or roll over the. So the major problem is for both Pakistan and Sri Lanka is their external debt proportionate debt. That does not mean that India doesn't have a problem. India's share of external debt in India is not very large; it's less than 20%. But large fiscal deficits and debt. Now we are somewhere about 92% of GDP is a cause for concern. Why? Now, when you have large deficits, obviously, interest payment becomes it's almost a quarter.
Yeah, that's a staggering figure, right? 25% of all our tax revenues are going into paying interest for previous.
But that's not the only problem. Problem is when ultimately when the money is taken from the market and then by the government, two things happen. One is money is taken abroad. Where do you take the money? It's household sector's financial savings. If the government takes more of it, less is available to the private sector to borrow. So obviously, sort of household sector financial saving at certain point of time was about 10 to 12%. Now, if the government itself borrows 12% of GDP, then public enterprises are there. Then what will leave? The private sector. So that way you crowd out the private sector. That's the second problem. Third problem is the burden on the future generation. The fourth problem is that when the government borrows, Viral Acharya wrote a beautiful book on fiscal dominance of monetary policy. What is that? Basically, government Reserve Bank of India wants to keep the yield curve low, wants to keep the interest, it wants to lend money to the government at low interest. And when you do that, what you do is the financial repression. When you do the financial repression, there are a whole lot of other distortions that follow. And we don't know, we can't quantify those distortions. So obviously there is a serious problem in borrowing. Some borrowing is inevitable. But then the borrowing has to be not for paying salaries and subsidies and interest. If the borrowing has to be there, it can be done for a productive purpose. I mean, there is nothing new in what I am saying. But obviously, every government will have to borrow. But then it is necessary to be prudent. You can't be saying that I borrow and I pay that, use it for pay revision or paying subsidies. That's where the problem comes.
So another linked question, not in the scope of this book, but you talked about financial repression, right? And how interest is kept low and government borrow. I think we have used. So that's the classic thing that China has also done, right? There is a lot of fiscal repression, financial repression, and the government is able to borrow, interest rates are kept low, etc. So from a public finance perspective, I'm just interested in understanding how do you see China's apparent success, not apparent, actual success on so many economic fronts?
There are two things. One is China embarked on a labor-intensive industrialization and activated its township and village enterprises to be a great competitors. And then obviously they didn't have the type of labor laws and the type of problem rigidities in the system. Now, when that happened, the other thing that they contributed, they typically follow the market rate policy. What is that? Kept the exchange rate, low, so that their thrust was to have external competition and push, make it a factor in the world. Push. So what they've done is initially they actually were doing a labor-intensive business. As the rates started going up, and they started moving up the value chain. And their crucial, vehicle for that was the township and village enterprises. If you remember, until 1994, their tax GDP ratio was very low. Even now, it is not very high. Now, in 1994, they actually re-centralized the taxes. Earlier, what used to happen is that the provinces used to collect the taxes and give it to the center. And provinces never gave it to the center. Particularly for the enterprises had to give their profits to the center. So these people will ask these enterprises to do a lot of, infrastructure work in their jurisdictions. So there was a lot of off-budget spending that was happening. And obviously money was not going up. And since that happened, since 1994, they re-centralized the tax. And when they re-centralized, the revenue started going up. But at the same time, it's not that the tax GDP ratio is extremely high. But then, as I said, their export earnings have been significant, and for the reason I mentioned, and they pushed a lot, gave a lot of thrust to exports, and kept the exchange rate low, and that was the way. I mean, you are the China expert.
But I'm just thinking this financial depression which has happened over all these decades, that will come back to bite at some point of time, right? Household sector savings are being used for government expansionary projects.
Now, that is precisely the reason why you need to contain your fiscal deficit. And that is one of the reasons why we are not able to move into a capital account convertibility. See, the point is you can't move to a capital account convertibility. If you have large fiscal deficits. So you need to contain that.
Okay, so now I want to move on the expenditure side, and then I'll come back on the tax side as well. But one general figure is over the last century, governments have expanded expenditure massively, right? So Wagner's rule, which you taught us about how, as a country gets richer, actually their government's role in the economy in terms of expenditure also becomes bigger. So whether you call a US capitalist economy or not, its governments totally spend nearly 40% of the GDP, right? And for India, it is around approximately 25-26%. So is this inevitable? Like, are we seeing over the next few years, India's government will also be bigger, spending more, and isn't that a cost of money?
Think about it. If an economy is continuously growing, and if income elasticity of public expenditure is greater than 1, as you say, at some point in time, you should put up 100%. So, in fact, Richard Burr, when he was criticizing Wine Guru, shifted in a paper, which was testing, he was testing Wagner's law in a cross-section of countries, as you were talking about, US versus India. He said, this is just not a law, this is philosophizing about history. You can't call it a law. It's coming more or less like Malthus coming up and saying that it's a certain point of time there will be destruction and then population will control itself. I mean there is no scientific thing into that. And again, you were talking about what Wagner's law is going to change over time. When you are talking about sort of levels in different points at a countries at different points of time. So obviously you can't, there is not any law. There is another interesting thing, an extension of this. Extension of this is peacock cohesion and displacement technique. They studied public experience in UK for over 100 years and found one typical pattern that whenever there is a major upheaval, social upheaval, World War I, World War II, the public expenditure will suddenly jump as a percentage of GDP. But after the event is over, it doesn't come back to the original level. It continues in a higher level. They call it a displacement effect. The logic to that is the following. In peaceful times, there is an idea of tolerable burden of taxation and a desirable level of public expenditure. Desirable level of public expenditure is always higher than tolerable level of taxation. So whenever there is social upheaval, then the total burden of taxation goes up and then remains at that. And actually, Shivchandra Gupta using did his economic analysis to show that it goes up, but over a period of time, elasticity declines over a period of time. There's a fascinating discussion. I mean, these are all academic discussion. But basically, this is on the trends in publication. I do refer to that in the
So, with the pandemic, are we going to see this Peacock-Weisman hypothesis play out in India? The public expenditures have risen, but they won't drop down back to the earlier levels.
No, the interesting part is I don't think the total part of taxation has gone up. Public expenditure, I mean, let us understand. The government has been underspending on public health. There has been, no country of a development cannot have a public expenditure GDP ratio at about 1.5, 1.2, 1.2%. States and central. So we have neglected it, thinking that people will take care of themselves. Now, obviously, suddenly the expenditure has increased. Health expenditure possibly would increase. It would come, there will be direct pandemic expenditure, but then there are people health expenditure and they include health expenditure. But then it is not such a large, amount. Public expenditure will come down. Suppose you have a fiscal deficit of 13% in 2019, 2021, central plus state taken together. And immediately they are trying to reduce it. And center's fiscal deficit is being basically at 6.7% for 2021-22, and they are budgeted for 6.4%. We'll have to see. There will be restrictions on that. They will have to explain why explain to the parliament. But I don't think there will be an elevated level. But if you have seen one interesting pattern in public expenditure, you leave out these 2 years, 2-3 years. It has always been, irrespective of whichever party was in power, it has always been about 26-27%. Steady in the last 20 years. So I don't see any upheaval happening because of the pandemic. And it has happened, but I think eventually it will come down to that.
Interesting. All right. So another question on the expenditure side. So in the book, you've written about how it is important to eliminate many of the subsidies, and that the government should think in terms of rolling out a basic minimum income by excluding those families who pay income tax and GST, employers in the formal sector, and those owning cars and two-wheelers. So there's a lot of debate nowadays about UBI and versions of it. So how do you think such a system would be possible in the Indian context, because targeting is difficult, there will be leakages, etc. So with our capacity constraints.
There are capacity constraints. Targeting is an issue, but then how long will you go on saying targeting is an issue? At certain point of time, you have Aadhaar. You can link Aadhaar with a number of other indicators to see, and you were able to target food grains during the pandemic. So based on the, so you may have to refine it, but then at the end of the day, the reason why I'm saying these cash transfers are better than subsidies is that subsidies distort prices, whereas cash transfers are just cash transfers. Whenever you say that urea prices are reduced, there will be excess use of urea as compared to other fertilizers. So now PM Kisan, that's a cash transfer. So obviously you will have to do more and more of such things rather than trying to say that I'm going to distort the prices. And then again the question, role of the state. Why prices have to be discovered in the market? Why should the government control prices? I mean, I am not able to understand this. You say, even if you take the case of drugs, these are life-saving drugs. The producers don't want to produce that drug. You will have to purchase it from elsewhere. Now, obviously the production will take place only when they have profits. And if you say that I will eliminate the profit by reducing the price, they will do something else. So we need to really, one of the things that we need to do is this meddling with prices. We have to be very careful. And again, suddenly we come up with it. Oh, now there will be wheat shortage, so we will export, ban exports. I mean, see, it creates a lot of this thing in the international market. And whether this wheat or some other industrial product or drugs or whatever, the multinationals want to make the investment. You see what you are saying. The policy regime is. Really, I mean, that's a different issue altogether.
So now coming to the tax side, another contemporary debate is every year nowadays one report comes out which will say that inequality is rising. So the solution for inequality rising is impose one or the other form of wealth tax. You already alluded to corporation tax and why that is a different thing. So from a public finance perspective, how should people look at these kinds of arguments batting for wealth tax?
As I said, there was a gentleman from young man called Subhanshu Kumar, and I did some academic work where we took international data, controlled for per capita income, urbanization, and income from natural resources that used to be the government. Like in the case of Middle East. They don't have to bother about taxes because they have oil. So we control for the countries with taxes. So after controlling, we try to find out what should have been on an average the taxes in India. Our analysis showed that it should be about 19-20%. What we are getting is somewhere about 16.5 to 17%. Central trust is getting to the. Now the question is, why does it happen? It happens because of one, agriculture cannot be taxed. Even when ITC comes in under the agricultural corporation, some other companies come, you can't claim the tax. This is a study which was done at NIT by some of my colleagues. And they said that you can get at least another 0.5% more. What about? Now the problem is that using that exemption, a lot of others basically declare their income as agricultural income in the water. And then you have, as I said, several other exemptions and concessions given to them. Suppose you say that I don't you take a concession given to savings. I mean, if you really think about it, it's a joke. Why is it a joke? 1.5 lakhs under 80 you get 5 years you save. After 5 years, you simply go. There is no fresh income, fresh saving that you do. Why? Because 1.5 is there, and then so the picture saying you saved 6 years ago, which 5 years ago has matured. So you put that here, and so and then there's 80D for insurance purposes, health insurance. Now, are you trying to give more business to insurance companies, or are you trying to sort of have the safeguard the health of it? If it is safeguard the health of the people, this thing should be for the health. But you are giving it for health insurance. Basically, in other words, there are lots of these. There was one exercise done for direct taxes code. When Chidambaram was the finance minister. And then obviously there was a lot of, everybody said yes, everybody else's concession should go, but not mine. So then what they did is that discussion went and Pranab Mukherjee came and then he put out another restoring all the exemptions. That didn't happen. The new government came, now they are actually trying to do this. But the basic thing is that you can't have a tax policy which is a common or I mean, you can't be saying that it should be encourage savings, it should be encourage investment in such assets, it should encourage infrastructure companies, it should encourage small scale industries, it should encourage exports, it should, regional things. I mean, how many things you want to do? I think you clean it up, have a simple 20% tax, and you will get all the money that you need. And but then you have this hangover. So if you have a hangover everything, you will have to have the threshold. And after threshold, you want to have 3-4 rates. And then complicates the matter. So obviously, if broaden the base, reduce the rate, reduce the rate, have a simple.
Right. Yeah. So I have one question from the audience. I put this on Twitter, and there were 3 or 4 very interesting questions. So one was related to non-tax revenue. So the question that Akshay asked is, what are the institutional capabilities the government needs to build as an asset manager to mobilize non-tax revenues? These days, tax base for direct taxes will anyways be low. So non-tax revenue would be the key. So basically, what are institutional changes to get non-tax?
As of now, much of the non-tax revenue comes from the Reserve Bank's transfer from the Reserve Bank, and part of it is that, and then obviously the profits, share of profits. The other non-tax revenues are very low. I think across the board, whether it is a local body or state or when the government, first of all, the government should not get involved in commercial activities. But at least until the time you get rid of the commercial activities, you should, sort of, you should the price properly so that you at least you cover the cost. You are not covering the cost. Now, you take sort of Bangalore. What's usually the amount of congestion that takes place, and parties are absolutely such, and there is no place for that. And then obviously private sector is not coming there, have a parking place, unlike elsewhere, because there is a freeze in the prices. You can't have a price. So there are problems of this nature. So non-tax revenues can be important, provided you have a proper pricing policy and proper, and then obviously you should get rid of most of the sort of production only in the company. Because huge amount of money lost is as important as money gained.
So, if there are any questions, please ask. I have a lot of questions, so you better intervene, otherwise I will keep asking. So, anyways, I will Anubhav, you have a question.
Okay. So, so this is again one of our topics that we've spoken about earlier. Given that I think you have, FRBM targets have not been met. Back to expenditure, FRBM targets have not been met consistently over the years, whether it's pandemic, pre-pandemic, etc. Budget estimates are often all over the place. And third, I think there's increasing amount of creative accounting when reporting budget deficits, etc. What is the best solution out there to solve for these three? Is it a fiscal council? Is it a debt ceiling like the US? Is it some other thing that we might not be aware of? What would be the best way to go about this?
I will put that question this way. When the markets fail, you need the government to. What do you do when the government fails? The basic question that you need to ask is, how do you prevent the government failure? Now, obviously, the Judge Finance Commission said that they have sort of enacted the fiscal responsibility budget. Incidentally, it is not necessary. You look at Article 292 of the Constitution, and that basically says that the Parliament can impose restrictions on the volume of foreign. What was Portugal doing? I mean, you didn't have to have the within there. You say that in the Article 292 of the Constitution, it basically says Parliament can place restrictions on the volume of foreign. But anyway, every 10 years we had a sort of fiscal deficit exposure. You had it in 18, you had it in 19, you had it in 2008, you had it, now obviously to 20, etc. Now, in fact, yes, Sherman did the groundwork for Secretary Finance for that at the time. He was the one who actually worked with it. And the Trust Finance Commission eventually made a recommendation that fiscal, the fiscal ability of the center and the state together should drop 6%. The logic was that household sector saving was 10% of GDP at the time. Household sector's financial saving was 10% of GDP. Now, the foreign saving, current account deficit comes to somewhere around 1.5%. If you keep the 1.5% for the public enterprises, you have 10% GDP available. After that, if you keep this is a reserve 4% of GDP for the private sector to borrow. The remaining amount is 6%, 3% for the sector, 2% for the state. Why only household sector? Because there are three sectors. Corporate sector is not going to create an additional savings for you. Government sector is not going to create any savings for you. It's only the household sector. So 6% of GDP was done. Then what happened? From 2003 to 2007, there was significant improvement. In fact, in 2007, fiscal deficit of the center and the state together was 5.5%. That's because the tax revenues, because of the application of technology, the tax information network, there was a significant increase in tax revenue, and that brought it up. 2008 was an election year. Three major decisions: farm loan waiver, pay commission award, and extension of employment guarantee for the children to employment. The whole budget was, went for a toss. Then the center, they budgeted for 2.5%. Oil prices also went up, eventually ended up 7.5%. Big time. So then now notes we have been struggling to contain them. Now, let me come to the specific. There have been, obviously, finance ministry has a very difficult job. I mean, it's not an agreeable job. They want trying, but then there is so much of a subsidy and transfer that is in the system that it's not easy to remove it. There is always a pressure. The pressure basically in the extent of pressure that the government exerts to contain it results in compression of capital. Capital expenditure has progressively been reduced as a percentage of GDP. So that means the productivity of expenditure has been declined. Now that is one of the reasons why actually the Fiscal Finance Commission made a recommendation that we should have what is called a fiscal, we should have a committee which should monitor the entire thing, which should convert itself into a fiscal policy, which will be reported to the finance ministry. So I wrote an article basically saying that this is no solution because finance ministry will appoint a committee and it will report to the finance ministry. And what is the sign? The same thing was done by the FRBM review committee. So in fact, in one of the meetings, I did mention it in the 15th Finance Commission. They are an advisory council and I said that this is no solution. Instead, 14th Finance Commission has been a recommendation, which basically said that you will amend the FRBM and appoint a fiscal council. And that fiscal council with three major tasks. One is evaluate the budgetary forecast that you are talking about. The second, and then keep telling you, feeding the government saying that the budgetary forecast on one time to make a correct forecast is what will happen. Second thing is various policies are being promoted.
For that, you'll have to turn off aeroplane mode.
Find out what is the expenditure related to that. And that is monitor the fiscal tracking to the year. Now, obviously, the government has been quiet on that. And the 15th Finance Commission has also made the same recommendation. So, obviously, the committees can make a recommendation. Now, there is also a question. See, if there is the political will, you don't need an additional constraint. If there is no political will, even if you consider nothing will work. But then you need to have institutions, systems and institutions to tell the public at large that there is a problem. People are not aware that there is a problem here and then government has not been telling the complete truth. Any government, I'm not talking. So therefore, when the government, to prevent the government failure, you need systems and institutions to be. Now, how effective they will be depends. The IMF studies have shown that in place in countries where they have this independent fiscal institutions, the things have turned out to be much better. Outcome has been much better.
Yeah. So now moving to another hotly contested area in public finance, which is fiscal federalism. Right? Everyone discusses about that. So I have a question on that. Sarthak also had a question. There's a lot of debate, and one thing that often comes up is how states in South India contribute a large sum of money to the divisible pool, but get only a small amount back in return. Right? So how do you see this from a public finance?
Let me ask you a very simple question. How does a rich man become rich? Because other people buy his things, he becomes rich. Because you have a large market in the, which is throughout the country. This is throughout the country. Obviously, when somebody produces, and that is bought all over the country, whether it is a GST or the income tax, a person paying income tax from Bangalore would have earned his income from all over the world. It is not that he has earned income only in Bangalore. No, this is a political argument. It is a division. In fact, most economists take this up. It's sad. But the basic point is income earned somewhere is from all over the place. And you have a large common market, and from the large common market, you derive income, and then obviously when that, the country takes for the national public good. And there is a lot of other things. It is not just the tax. There are lots of implicit transfers that take place. There is a credit deposit ratio in the banking. Most of the credit and deposit is done by poorer states. Most of the borrowing is done from elsewhere. And mind you, in a controlled interest rate regime, who really gains? So whenever there are, controls on prices and controls on prices and output, which is the legacy of our planning country. There will be invisible transfer. I wrote an article way back in 1998, and it was published in 2000. It's called Invisible Transfers in the Indian country. Trying to estimate the subsidy element in the borrowing of the states. When the states borrow at a repressed interest rate. Now, which of the states borrow more? You will see very clearly that much of the explicit transfers get transferred. So I think one needs to be a little more careful by saying that I have earned the money, my state has earned the money, and I have that there is something called regional policy. Government of India makes a lot of investment in different states. It's not a transfer, but it locates its investments and it locates its various plans and various other things in various states. That's also, UP is very huge defense corridor. Okay, government of India is spending money on that. Now, obviously, you are putting purchasing power there. So I think needs a lot more work before we can do that. This is not right for politicians to speak, but we as economists have to be more careful. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So I just wanted to add to that. Your name is a further question. My name is Akash.
Okay, good.
So again, a lot of these times when these debates happen, they don't take into account policies like trade equalization policy from the 1950s that did hurt states like Bihar and Bengal, now at the expense of southern states, many southern states, including Tamil Nadu. Now, my question again on GST, GST has been in the news recently. You've written a lot about it as well. And the states are fighting for this fiscal autonomy, but most or almost all of them have been very hesitant to devolve power in general to their local governments. Power in general and fiscal flow in particular. So what can be, from a public finance perspective, what can be some innovative ways in which local governments can be empowered?
My guru used to say, the man who mentored Redistribution, everybody wants decentralization, wants only up to his level. Not beyond. So the states have been trying on the centralization by the center, but then they are unwilling to pass the devolve the powers to the local bodies. There is a bit of a problem. There is a birth defect in the 73rd and 74th amendment. What is the birth defect? The birth defect is as follows. You said that these are all the local self-governments. But then you look at entry 5 in the state list, which basically says that the responsibility for local government is that of a state. Now the states cannot do anything, and the local bodies cannot, change their taxes, charge anything, do anything until the state government approves. They don't have, power. They don't have the devolution of functionaries, or finances. So they have the Cinderellas of the Cinderellas. Because the central states, if the states say that they are the Cinderellas, local bodies say that they are the Cinderellas of the Cinderellas. Now you have a problem. Possibly you need to really relook at the constitution, and then have a separate, area list of both revenue and expenditures for the local bodies. And then you tell me who is the activist in the local body? Some IAS officer of the state gathered who is being sent as a municipal commissioner. Why is it that the Bangalore Municipal Corporation cannot appoint its own commissioner? Well, can it? So there is who thinks there is something called the State Finance Commission. But by now there should have been 6 state finance commissions. 6. How many states have? Some of them are having the Senate Commission. Now commissions are supposed to be appointed by the governor of it. I mean, he acts on the advice of the chief minister. Now there's a huge amount of literature there. So the point is, see, they amended the constitution, but not really thinking that they should function in a manner. There are states which wanted to take a pride, and like Kerala. It's a very interesting thing. 14th Finance Commission made a recommendation that the money should be transferred to the local bodies, and center should not add any conditions to it, and then this should be unconditional. State should not have any further conditions, because the 13th Finance Commission, when it transfers the money, they put lots of conditions. All these conditions have to be fulfilled by the state government for the local bodies to get the money. And he said that this is a very mistake. He said we put some condition. And one is that the more the money you raise at the local body, more the money you get. And then obviously, you quantify the, the public service delivery standards, and then, get some money, they basically that. Now what happened? Grants are given. A Kerala cadre IAS officer was the secretary at the central level for rural development. He added his own conditions. Finance Commission had not put the conditions. Specifically, he said no. He put conditions. So what do you do? Finance Commission is, we give the recommendation and we all die. We go away. We don't. So, and the 15 Finance Commissions, and then my good friend Ashok Tahir was the one who was right. They put additional conditions. Now, all these conditions have to be put in by the state government for the local body to take. So there are a lot more of things. First of all, our own thinking has to be clear. 73rd, 74, 73rd, 74, we keep repeating what not really meaning what we are talking. Now, the state government of Punjab comes and abolishes the property. You could say that properties are 58 square meters, no, we don't pay the tax. So, I mean, and then, when the planning commission was there, Chief Minister Punjab goes to the plan for planning schedule of planning commission and comes out and does the best. And oh, look at these fellows, they are treating us as municipalities. So as a municipality, I cannot use that. What I'm trying to say is that there has to be a mindset. Decentralization cannot be imposed from the just come from. So we need to work on it.
Sarthak, sorry, Suman, go ahead and then we'll go to Sarthak.
Sorry, the answers are very long.
Sir, you spoke about subsidies versus cash transfer. When subsidies are distorting markets, the prices, inflation, cash transfers will add to inflation. So, inflation will affect the poor great. So, do you think cash transfers are just a lesser evil than subsidies, or are they?
I'm looking at the differential. In the first grade standard, there is absolute incidence, there is a differential incidence. Differential incidence is when one instrument is taken out and another instrument is what is it? If you take out the subsidy and have a direct target with cash transfer, the poor are taken care of. And inflation, and by giving subsidy, for example, you are only increasing the fiscal deficit. That is some other thing that is happening. And if it's a higher fiscal deficit, you will have to inflation. So at the end of the day, you need to be wary. And in addition to that, as I said, you take it this way. Direct cash transfer is the negativity of tax. Subsidy is a negativity of tax. It's just that. So you need to see the alternative, what alternative that you are doing, and then calibrate that.
So my question was also something related to what I asked. So when it comes to states and union, right, still states have some amount of leverage when it comes to devolution of funds, but the local bodies might not have that much leverage as well when it comes to devolution from the states to the local bodies. So what can be some solution to that?
No, that's right. You see, in the case of states, although there is huge amount of centralization in the union, there is what we call the centripetal bias. There is a separate list of 7 schedules. There is a union list, the state list, is the concurrent list. There is a huge amount of encroachment on the state list and the concurrent list by the union government. And then obviously the state themselves, have not objected to many of them. The centrally sponsored states, for example. You get money, so you go away, you bribe it, you just go away. But then there is certain areas which are, which are clearly demarcated. Whereas in the case of the local bodies, there is schedule 11 and 12, or 12 and 13, one of them, which basically earmarks certain areas, not list certain, not list certain areas for local bodies and other. But then it also says that the states are not supposed to, they may take that into account, but not necessary that they have, there is no compulsion for them to pass on that powers, or they can, some amount of that power. They're all in concurrent. So they don't have a specific, so they have to depend upon the state government to give them specific mandates, give them specific, sort of sources of revenue, and that's the basic thing. And the other thing is that, the entire governance, why can't DTMP advertise for a chief executive and get him? Why should only the state government employees have to come and look up? These are some of the questions. See, if you really want to see the private sector knowledge, but then it has been accepted that basically the state government will look after the local. Now, on the one hand, it gives grants for some money, and then on the other hand, it takes away money for the electricity. Say that, oh, then they adjust the electricity or net money that will be. And these people are also not, see, they also want us to soft budget constraint. You see, at the end of the day, there is a major problem between the private sector and the government. Either the private sector, when it does badly, has to go bust. It goes to, so. Whereas the government doesn't go bust. Somebody will come and pay. So obviously there is no incentive for, the soft budget constraint. There is no incentive for being efficient. I mean, these are general issues. That's one of the reasons why you need to limit the role of the government itself. That's why I go back to that. But the basic issue here is that there is no vested interest to have a proper decentralization process in the country.
Can I have a follow-up question? I mean, for some states in India, the devolution per capita will be higher to the local bodies, while in other states it's low. So is it because of historical factors or institutionally are they different? For example,
there are a variety of reasons. In the sense that there is endowment. To begin with, there may be a lot of endowment, natural resources, various other things. There may be, sort of investments that are being made. And obviously, there have been investments in education, in healthcare, in many places. I mean, you look at the entire Kerala, they get a huge amount of money from remittances. That's because initially they made investment in education and healthcare, and most of them, not very high level, most of them migrated to Middle East. So you take, so the coastal Karnataka area, the first. I mean, if you look at it, you see the, social indicators there, apart from the separation that's happening now. But if you really look at the social indicators, they are not worse than any advanced country in the world. Whether it is the Dakshina Kannada or the Udupi district, whether it's education, healthcare, or every social indicator. Not that they have a lot of resources, but the education levels are extremely high. So, so there can be a variety of reasons. And he did talk about right equalization. The vestiges of that have continued. This is from 1950 onwards. Almost for 30 years it had continued. Where inputs like coal and steel was made available throughout the country at the same price. And whatever is the transportation cost was subsidized. So one of the bad examples of subsidy is this right equalization policy. Now what happened is most of the people made investments in places where the natural resources are not there for a variety of reasons. Now if you come up and say that you close it down, I mean, will they be able to do it? Now in the process they continue to do that. So the coal and steel will continue to be transported from Jharkhand, Kolkata, West Bengal, and Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, and all. I mean, these are some of the, sort of points we have committed. So vestiges of that will continue. Just as vestiges of planning will continue to do.
I think you answered. Yeah. Dr. Rao, I think it's very clear even before this book, and this book makes it very clear that public finance and fiscal policy requires a high degree of training, analytical rigor, skills, and expertise. Whether it's at the union level or even if it's at the municipal or a gram panchayat level, there needs to be a background philosophical understanding of public finance before you start taxing or spending. Now, clearly, that level of that kind of human capacity does not exist in the country the way the quantity that is required Even, I mean, just the number of municipalities or gram panchayats, so even if you have to say 1:10 ratio, you need one expert for every 10 of these. You just don't have that. So what in your view is a way we could increase the capacity of public finance analysts? And second question, what are the states or what are the places where you've seen an attempt being made to solve this problem?
On the first, I entirely agree with you. I mean, it is not that, except that you don't require a very highly sophisticated way of thinking about it. So long as you disable your say, or ideological politics. You know, I mean, how many people are willing to say, no, state is not necessarily a library. There can be problems with the state. So whenever something happens, oh, the state government is not involved, the government is not involved. We don't ask why we want what we are doing. That's now, apart from that, basically, whatever I spoke about, there is nothing, I don't think there is anything new. I mean, it's simple, saying that, I mean, you know, opportunity cost is the most important thing that you have to do. Now, of course, there are several principles. There is some theory, there is some logic to that. So when I was in National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, I joined there as a director in 2003. From 2005 onwards, I started a training course for university teachers, university and college teachers, during summer for 1 month. And I used to find resources for paying their transportation costs to Delhi. I mean, we had a hostel where there were 30. So, what a mix of people from north, south, east, and west. And then one full month training program for university teachers. At certain point of time, I actually did the South Asian students as well. Some do from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, Nepal. But in that was a kind of successful. And I asked the government of India, you know, the promotion person was the chief saying that I want to continue this show. And certain money was earmarked for that purpose. Now, then what happened after I left, they diluted it, they made it to 2 weeks, they made it 1 week. And then they did not do during summer vacation because summer vacation is the time free time. That's the time when they can come. Now, one of the major problems that I have seen as a person who has been consumer of this consumer of talent, you know, I had to hire that quality of public finance teaching in the country. It has been bad. You know, you don't really have many public finance departments in many places. And if they have it, it's the same old stuff they will say. Now, I think keeping the mind open and having the so I mean it did help in spreading it quite a bit. But that's not enough. I think it should be continuous process. Madras School of Economics has opened an advanced center for public finance. But then advanced, they still have to report, they are not able to get it. And you know, the series of articles are being is alternating with like series of articles. But I haven't GST for the last 2 weeks ago. No, but then one of the things I have suggested is that we should have this. I think this is important that many of these institutions should take this up. And people who are, you know, one of the problem that affects our economics profession generally is ideology. We already have a direction. We already think that this is the thing. I think it's better to keep our mind so far. And then look at the processes and numbers. Then let's so it's a long game. And people have to realize, I think in Dharma University, they're going to have a public finance conference towards the end of this month. I'm going to be speaking there and going to tell what they have to do. You know, now since I don't have to do anything more, it's like I'm still, but I think there is a need for a consolidation and an institution like National Institute of Public Finance and Policy should really revive that. And put that director going to be that would be like a Chakravarti in the director will also there. Where I think a new director has to go. Anyway, when I take the camera. But what a lot of even then, for example, Mr. Raman has been working with the consultants. Yeah. Trying to, but then the basic defects in the system, has to be actually. People have been writing on how elected the state next commissions are being this that. But I think time has come where we need to consider the constitutional position. And then the demand for decentralization has to come. If everybody thinks, because all the revenue comes from Masood, and everybody thinks that there are dangers of decentralization, that's the problem.
Yeah, we have time for one more question. So you were.
Yeah, can we think of taxing agricultural income earned by corporates and leave the non-corporate earners to be from income? My point is that two types of people are earning agricultural income. So agricultural income earned by farmers and all that individuals, that will be exempt from income tax. And can we tax agricultural income of corporates only?
Now I would say this way, that you see, when Vijay Kelkar was working on task force and direct taxes, I think it was 2002 or 2002. I made a suggestion, and then they actually made that recommendation. See, when you buy the income tax return, you actually indicate that what your agricultural income is and non-agricultural income is. And I said that you take, looking at that, you have an agreement with the state, because agricultural income has to be taxed by the states. Let the center have an agreement with the states, saying that we will collect tax on that agricultural income and pay that benefit to the rest of the state. And that recommendation was made, and there was such a furor in the parliament. And Kelkar told me that, oh, because of that, I almost lost my job. That's it. So this has been going on, thinking about that going on. But the point is, even if you don't say the contrary, it's not just the registered one. There are lots of other businesses who don't register and can do this. So one has to find a way of dealing with that, and the states have to realize that more than encouraging the farmers, I think there are other ways of encouraging the farmers. As I said, the PM Kisan and they said this is one of the ways. Now you can have certain other cash transfer or the farm insurance, and carry over provision for losses. You have the carry over provision for the losses if there is a loss in a particular year. And if you bring in that, but then the states have to think. When we say states, it's a farmer's law. So it's a whole curve.
All right. So one last point. So you observed India's public finance and the economy over the last 5 decades or so. So what is it? You discussed what are the problems, etc. But what are a few things that give you hope from the system?
Well, one can put a laundry list of things. That's not there are lots of things, not just the public finance. Public finance is only a small part of it. And I don't think this is, and lots of people have it. And so there is a reform agenda. I think we are going to talk ourselves about the book. In the book itself, there are lots of things that I have said. The last chapter on public finance and private finance actually speaks about these reforms that we have undertaken. Again, there has to be a mindset that we need to undertake. In the sense that, labor laws. Now they are again talking about it. There are several laws, there are codified into code. quotes, but then I don't know what is. And then there is this particular thing, small is beautiful, small is not beautiful. I'm sorry. And you create a policy environment for the small to remain small. Because you think that small is beautiful. Small has to become medium, has to become large.
Only government has to become small.
Agree. Now, reservations, all sorts of these things are known. All the time of medium and small scale industries. Medium scale industry should be encouraged to become bigger industry. So we need to really, the whole lot of policy environment needs to be changed. And then there is another thing. And so long as you keep closing yourself from the rest of the world, you have no incentive to undertake reforms. If you want to undertake reforms, you need to open. Increasing tariffs and increasing creating non-tariff barriers is not going to help you to reform yourself. You will not become popular. And unfortunately, we are moving in the other direction. So, as I said, there can be several issues that one can talk about. But that's where I stop.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rao. As always, it was very educational, and thank you so much. Anyone who's interested in public policy must read this book. We have 2 copies at Takshashila as well, so if anyone wants to read it, please feel free to come here and read it. And of course, you can buy it on Amazon. Okay, so thank you so much, all of you, for joining, and those online who joined us also.